Ted Cruz did not walk into that Senate room looking like a man hunting a viral moment, because he walked in like a man setting a trap that would only snap shut after the audience had watched enough to feel certain. Ilhan Omar, by contrast, arrived with the posture of someone who expected the moral high ground to hold, because she believed the subject matter would keep the spotlight on threats, bias, and the atmosphere around public life. The chairs, the microphones, the neatly arranged binders, and the quiet pre-hearing chatter created the illusion that this would be an orderly conversation about principles rather than a struggle over credibility. But anyone who has watched Washington long enough knows that hearings are not designed to resolve disputes, because they are designed to brand narratives into the public memory. That is why the first 10 minutes matter more than the last 10 minutes, since first impressions become the frame that everything else is forced to live inside. Cruz's opening approach in this dramatized scenario is not to accuse with adjectives, because adjectives trigger arguments about tone and intent rather than arguments about substance. Instead, he uses the oldest legal method in the book, which is to introduce a record, ask for ownership, and then let the silence force the witness to fill gaps under pressure. Omar's instincts are equally political and equally rational, because she knows a record can be selectively curated, and curated records are how opponents manufacture patterns that erase nuance. So even before the first quote appears on a screen, both sides are already fighting over a deeper question. Who gets to define what the public is allowed to interpret? And the audience senses it immediately, because the atmosphere shifts from sympathetic listening to a kind of collective leaning forward, the way people lean in when they smell a confrontation coming. Here is where I put my view plainly, right after the hook, because pretending to be neutral while telling a power story is the kind of performative honesty that exhausts people. My view is that the most dangerous political habit today is not loudness, because loudness is obvious, but the strategic use of implication that sounds like certainty while never fully accepting the burden of proof. A politician can be morally sincere and still deploy rhetoric that creates collateral damage, just like a politician can be morally cynical and still hide behind the language of justice. That is why I do not grade these exchanges only by who sounds right in the moment, but by what incentives the exchange teaches the next generation of politicians to adopt. If the lesson is that precision is optional and outrage is profitable, then even good people will gradually behave like gamblers who believe they can beat the house forever. Omar's preparation in this dramatized scene is built around a familiar modern dynamic. She expects the room to recognize the social costs of public identity and to treat those costs as proof of moral standing. There is a reason that approach often works, because audiences are human, and humans respond to vulnerability faster than they respond to procedural debates about language and framing. She is also aware that criticism of her rhetoric frequently arrives packaged with bad faith caricatures, so she anticipates that any confrontation will attempt to blur policy disagreements into personal attacks. So she enters ready to widen the lens, ready to place every clip inside context, and ready to remind the room that political speech is often policed unevenly depending on who speaks. That framing is persuasive to many people, but it becomes vulnerable the moment an opponent forces the conversation into a narrow corridor where context sounds like avoidance. Cruz's preparation, on the other hand, is built around a different audience psychology. He knows many voters feel manipulated by abstract moral language because abstract moral language can be used to dodge uncomfortable specifics. He also knows that the modern media ecosystem rewards binary clarity, because binary clarity produces clean clips, and clean clips travel like oxygen through algorithmic platforms. So his goal is to force Omar into answers that cannot be smoothed into ambiguity, because ambiguity is where public figures survive after they say something that many people find unacceptable. He keeps his tone controlled, not because he is kinder, but because calmness reads as credibility to audiences who associate emotional escalation with defensiveness. And the irony is that calmness can be theatrical too, because restraint is itself a performance when it is deployed with timing and intention. When the first quote appears, the real drama is not the quote itself, because most politically engaged viewers have seen a dozen partial quotes used as weapons in the last week alone. The drama is that the room becomes a laboratory for how reputations are constructed, because Cruz is trying to convert words into motive, and motive is how you convert critique into condemnation. Omar's first response, in a moment like this, is rarely to concede the framing outright, because concession can be clipped as a confession even when the reality is complicated. So she tries to establish a principle before she addresses the line, because principles create moral shelter, and moral shelter buys time. But Cruz refuses to debate principles yet, because debating principles gives her oxygen, while debating ownership keeps her pinned to the ground. This is the moment where the audience asks the controversial questions that media professionals love and politicians fear, because the questions reveal what viewers are actually watching for. Are we watching someone confront harmful rhetoric consistently? Or are we watching someone selectively weaponize standards to damage a rival who is inconvenient? Are we watching a public figure accept responsibility for rhetoric that lands with historical baggage? Or are we watching a public figure insist that intent should cancel impact because the impact is politically inconvenient? And here is the harsh question that hangs over the room, even when nobody says it out loud. If you want to lead a diverse society, why do you keep choosing language that you know will detonate in a diverse society? That question is not about ideology, because conservatives and progressives both fail it. And it is about discipline, which is harder than belief, because discipline requires self-limitation. Humor enters the exchange the way it always does in Washington, which is quietly, like a knife that never looks like a weapon until it is already cutting. A pause that lasts one beat too long becomes a punchline, and a witness who reaches for context too quickly can start sounding like a person who brought an umbrella to avoid a storm she knew was coming. Cruz's side uses that dynamic to signal confidence, because confidence is contagious, and contagious confidence looks like truth to people who are tired of uncertainty. Omar's side tries to counter with a different kind of humor, the kind that frames the interrogation as performative outrage, because mocking the performance is a way to drain it of power. The risk for both is that mockery can trivialize real concerns, and trivializing real concerns can make the speaker look like they are treating the audience's pain as an inconvenience. In a safe, platform-friendly narrative, the key is to keep the conflict anchored in accountability and public responsibility, rather than drifting into identity-based insult or unverifiable scandal. That is why this dramatized Part 1 focuses on the mechanics of the confrontation, the incentives behind it, and the rhetorical strategies each side is using to control how millions will interpret the same footage. If you want to build suspense without crossing lines, you do it by escalating stakes through framing, by tightening questions, and by exposing contradictions in posture rather than inventing secret plots. You can make the exchange feel heavy by emphasizing what is being risked, which is public trust and institutional legitimacy, rather than claiming hidden crimes that the audience cannot verify. And you can still make viewers stay because the real hook is not a shocking insult, but the promise that the pattern will become undeniable by the time the last answer is forced into the light. By the end of this first section, the hearing has not proven anything in a courtroom sense, because hearings rarely do, and anyone selling certainty that fast is selling a product. What it has done is establish the battlefield. Cruz wants a narrow corridor where every answer is yes or no, and Omar wants a wide landscape where motive, context, and lived experience set the terms. The room can feel that, and the audience can feel that, because the energy is no longer about policy detail. It is about who gets to keep moral credibility after the cameras clip the exchange into fragments. This is the point where viewers start choosing sides not on facts, but on what kind of leadership style they trust, in an era where trust is scarce and outrage is cheap. And that is exactly why you have to watch to the end. Because the real story is not the first quote, but the way each of them tries to force the public to interpret the same record in opposite ways. Once the opening frame had been set, the hearing stopped feeling like a conversation and started feeling like a test of endurance, because neither Ilhan Omar nor Ted Cruz expected to persuade the other in real time. They were both playing to audiences that would never sit in the same room, audiences that would interpret the same exchange through radically different moral filters. Cruz understood that if he could maintain control of pace and specificity, he could force the discussion to live in a narrow lane where ambiguity felt like evasion. Omar understood that if she allowed that lane to stay narrow for too long, every answer would become a liability regardless of how carefully it was worded. So the struggle in this phase was not about truth versus falsehood, but about who got to decide how wide the conversation was allowed to breathe. Cruz's method in this section is deceptively simple, because simplicity reads as confidence to viewers who are tired of political gymnastics. He introduces one documented statement at a time, asks a direct question, then resists the urge to interrupt when the answer drifts. That restraint is strategic, because every extra second of explanation sounds, to a skeptical audience, like rationalization rather than clarification. In the language of persuasion, he is forcing Omar to spend time, and time under pressure rarely favors the witness. Silence becomes an instrument, not because it is hostile, but because it makes every word that follows carry more weight. Omar's responses in this phase reflect a different calculation, one that many public figures from marginalized backgrounds learn quickly. She knows that conceding ground too early can be interpreted not as humility, but as weakness, especially by critics who already assume bad faith. So she leans into broader principles, emphasizing that criticism of governments, including allied governments, is not inherently bigotry. That position resonates with audiences who fear that moral accusations are being used to fence off legitimate debate. But it also creates friction with viewers who believe that certain historical phrases carry consequences regardless of intent. This is where the exchange becomes psychologically interesting, rather than merely political. Cruz is not only questioning Omar's words, he is questioning whether she recognizes how those words land outside her immediate political circle. Omar is not only defending herself, she is signaling to supporters that she will not allow opponents to define the boundaries of acceptable dissent. Both of them are acting rationally within their own incentive structures, even as those structures pull them further apart. And that is why the room feels tense in a way that has nothing to do with volume and everything to do with incompatible expectations. At this point, a viewer might reasonably ask a controversial question that neither side wants to address directly. If language predictably triggers fear or resentment in a specific community, does repeating that language become irresponsible, even if the speaker's intent is different? And on the other hand, if accusations of harm are selectively applied, depending on who speaks, Do they lose credibility as moral claims and become political tools instead? These questions are uncomfortable precisely because they do not produce clean heroes and villains. They force audiences to admit that moral reasoning is harder than partisan alignment. Cruz presses by returning to pattern rather than incident, because patterns suggest character, and character is what voters remember. He frames repetition as evidence that these are not isolated slips, but reflections of a worldview that deserves scrutiny. That framing is effective with audiences who believe that leaders should be judged by cumulative behavior rather than individual apologies. Omar counters by framing repetition as proof of targeting, arguing that her words are revisited endlessly while similar rhetoric from others passes unnoticed. This counter-argument lands with audiences who already suspect that outrage is unevenly distributed in American politics. Humor sneaks into this section in subtle ways, often through timing rather than punchlines. A pause after a question becomes a kind of wink to the audience, signaling that the answer is expected to struggle. A carefully neutral phrase like "help us understand" lands with a trace of irony, because everyone knows understanding is not the primary goal. Omar's occasional dry remarks about being asked the same questions repeatedly function as a pressure valve for supporters who see the exchange as performative. But humor is risky here, because levity can look like dismissal when the subject involves historical trauma or national tragedy. The deeper issue underneath this phase is not ideology, but trust calibration. Cruz is testing whether Omar can reassure audiences outside her base that she understands why certain language alarms them. Omar is testing whether Cruz's concern is sincere or selectively amplified for political advantage. Neither test can be definitively passed in a hearing, because sincerity is inferred, not proven. So the audience fills in the gaps using their prior beliefs, which is exactly how polarization feeds itself. From a narrative standpoint, this is the section where viewers begin to decide whether they see the exchange as accountability or ambush. Those who already distrust Omar interpret her emphasis on context as avoidance. Those who already distrust Cruz interpret his focus on specific language as a trap designed to provoke outrage. What's striking is that both interpretations can coexist without contradiction, because they are rooted in different assumptions about power. That coexistence is why political confrontations generate heat without resolution. As this part unfolds, the hearing no longer feels like it is about a single representative or a single senator. It starts to feel like a referendum on how American politics handles moral disagreement in a media-saturated environment. Can public figures acknowledge harm without surrendering their broader arguments? Can critics demand accountability without sliding into spectacle? And perhaps the hardest question of all, can audiences tolerate complexity long enough to reward it? By the end of this section, nothing has exploded. No decisive line has ended the exchange, and that is precisely the point. The tension has thickened rather than resolved, because both sides have entrenched their frames without fully collapsing the others. Cruz has narrowed the lens, forcing every subsequent answer to carry the weight of prior statements. Omar has widened the lens, reminding viewers that political speech does not exist in a vacuum and never has. And the audience is left suspended between two interpretations, knowing that whichever one they choose will say as much about them as it does about the people at the microphones. By the time the exchange moved into its next phase, the emotional temperature in the room had shifted in a way that seasoned observers immediately recognized. This was no longer about catching a witness off guard or forcing a clarification for the record. It had become a struggle over narrative authority, over who gets to define what the confrontation itself means. Both Ilhan Omar and Ted Cruz understood that whatever happened next would live far beyond the hearing room. This was the point where arguments stopped being reactive and started becoming declarative. Cruz adjusted his posture slightly, not in a dramatic way, but in a manner that signaled intention rather than aggression. He began connecting individual statements into a broader thesis, a move that transforms questioning into indictment without ever using the word. The logic was cumulative rather than explosive, designed to feel inescapable rather than shocking. Each reference was framed as another brick in a wall that Omar now had to climb rather than knock down. For viewers inclined towards skepticism, this kind of structure reads as seriousness rather than showmanship. Omar, sensing the shift, recalibrated her tone in response. She moved away from defensiveness and toward moral framing, invoking lived experience and structural bias as interpretive lenses. This was not accidental, because personal narrative functions as a shield against purely textual attacks. When words are separated from the speaker, they can be dissected clinically, but when reattached to identity, the dissection becomes ethically fraught. Omar was inviting the audience to consider whether context should temper condemnation. Here is where the confrontation revealed its deeper asymmetry. Cruz's authority derived from mastery of documents, precedent, and rhetorical sequencing. Omar's authority derived from representation, from embodying communities that historically have not been given the benefit of interpretive generosity. Each form of authority speaks to a different conception of justice, one procedural and one experiential. The conflict between them is not incidental, it is structural. A controversial question began to hover over the room, even if no one voiced it explicitly. Should public officials from marginalized backgrounds be granted more interpretive latitude because of historical power imbalances? Or does equal accountability require that all speech be judged by identical standards regardless of identity? Neither answer is cost-free, and both produce resentment in different directions. The hearing, intentionally or not, forced viewers to confront that dilemma without offering an escape hatch. Cruz leaned into historical continuity as his next rhetorical move. He emphasized that certain phrases and insinuations carry meanings that precede any individual speaker. In his framing, intent does not erase inheritance, because language accumulates weight across generations. This argument resonates strongly with audiences who see history as a moral ledger rather than a contextual backdrop. It also implicitly challenges the idea that sincerity alone can absolve rhetorical harm. Omar responded by challenging the selectivity of outrage itself. She pointed to other lawmakers whose rhetoric about minorities or immigrants had been excused as bluntness or passion. Her implication was not that her words were flawless, but that the rules of condemnation are unevenly enforced. This line of defense plays effectively with audiences who already suspect institutional hypocrisy. At the same time, it risks sounding like deflection to those who believe accountability should be individualized. The humor in this section was almost invisible unless you knew where to look. A raised eyebrow here, a faint smile there. Moments that allowed supporters on each side to exhale briefly. Cruz's occasional rhetorical understatement functioned as a kind of dry irony, letting the audience supply the punchline. Omar's wry acknowledgments of political theater subtly reminded viewers that the setting itself incentivizes conflict. These moments mattered because they humanized a confrontation that could otherwise feel purely adversarial. From an analytical perspective, this was the point where the exchange stopped being about persuasion and started being about sorting. Viewers were not being convinced so much as confirmed. Those inclined to see Omar as unfairly targeted saw Cruz's persistence as evidence of bad faith. Those inclined to see Omar as reckless saw her contextual defenses as evasion. The hearing became a mirror rather than a lesson. What made this phase particularly powerful was its lack of resolution. No single answer collapsed the argument, and no single question ended the debate. Instead, the confrontation deepened, existing interpretive grooves in the audience's mind. That deepening is often mistaken for impact, because it produces intensity without consensus. In modern political media, intensity is frequently mistaken for truth. As this section drew to a close, the room felt heavier rather than louder. The tension was no longer driven by anticipation of a gotcha moment, but by recognition of irreconcilable frameworks. Cruz had successfully framed the exchange as a matter of accountability, rooted in language and history. Omar had successfully framed it as a matter of power, identity, and selective moral enforcement. Neither framework defeated the other, and that unresolved collision was precisely what made the moment linger. As the confrontation moved deeper, the room entered a phase that felt less like a hearing and more like a philosophical collision staged under fluorescent lights. Both sides had now established their frames clearly enough that repetition would no longer add value, so escalation took a subtler form. The question stopped being about what was said and shifted toward what responsibility looks like once words escape intention and enter history. This was the moment when the audience could feel that neither participant was trying to win the other over. They were trying to define the rules by which future arguments would be judged. Ted Cruz leaned into what might be called institutional memory, the idea that democratic systems survive only when leaders internalize the consequences of language. He argued, without raising his voice, that power multiplies the effect of speech in ways ordinary citizens never experience. A sentence spoken from a congressional seat does not land as an opinion, but as a signal. Signals shape behavior, expectations, and fear, sometimes long after the speaker has moved on. In that framing, the moral burden of clarity increases with authority, rather than diminishing under pressure. Ilhan Omar responded by challenging the assumption that institutions themselves are neutral carriers of memory. She suggested that institutional memory has often been selective, preserving the harms done to some communities while erasing the harms done to others. From her perspective, demanding restraint from voices that already face heightened scrutiny can function as a silencing mechanism. If only certain groups are required to speak with surgical precision at all times, then equality becomes rhetorical rather than real. This reframing positioned her not as a defendant, but as a critic of the courtroom itself. At this stage, a difficult and controversial question became unavoidable, even if no one asked it directly. Can a system claim moral authority if it enforces linguistic discipline unevenly? And conversely, can moral urgency justify language that predictably inflames historical wounds? These questions do not cancel each other out, and pretending they do only deepens mistrust. The hearing, intentionally or not, forced the audience to sit with that discomfort. Cruz's next move was not to rebut Omar's identity-based critique head-on, but to narrow the lens again. He emphasized that recognizing systemic bias does not absolve individuals of responsibility for specific statements. In his view, structural injustice explains context, but it does not erase consequence. This distinction mattered because it allowed him to acknowledge inequality without conceding accountability. It was a careful rhetorical balance designed to appear fair rather than punitive. Omar countered by questioning whether consequence itself had become performative. She argued that outrage cycles reward those who frame conflicts in the starkest possible terms, regardless of whether that framing advances understanding. In this sense, the hearing itself risked becoming another data point in a media ecosystem that thrives on moral spectacle. Her implication was not that criticism was invalid, but that the mode of criticism often obscures the substance. This resonated with viewers exhausted by politics that feels more like theater than governance. Humor appeared again in fleeting, almost accidental ways. A dry remark about Twitter archaeology drew a ripple of nervous laughter, acknowledging how modern politics treats old posts as living documents. Cruz's brief pause before repeating a particularly loaded phrase functioned like a knowing glance toward the audience. Omar's understated observation that "we are very good at talking past each other" landed as both critique and confession. These moments mattered because they reminded viewers that both participants were aware of the absurdity baked into the process. The deeper tension in this phase centered on asymmetry of risk. For Cruz, the primary risk was reputational, the possibility of being seen as opportunistic or overly aggressive. For Omar, the risk was existential within politics, the possibility that any misstep would be used to delegitimize her broader voice entirely. Those risks are not equivalent, and acknowledging that does not require endorsing either side's conclusions. It simply requires honesty about how power operates differently depending on who holds it. This imbalance complicated the audience's moral calculus. Some viewers interpreted Cruz's persistence as necessary clarity in a climate of euphemism. Others saw it as an exercise in leverage, using institutional power to corner an ideological opponent. Likewise, some saw Omar's resistance as principled refusal to submit to bad faith framing. Others saw it as unwillingness to confront the full impact of her words. What made this section linger was its refusal to resolve into a clean takeaway. There was no viral line that definitively ended the exchange. Instead, the hearing accumulated weight, forcing viewers to confront the possibility that both accountability and empathy are being weaponized. When accountability feels like punishment and empathy feels like exemption, trust erodes on all sides. That erosion, more than any single statement, is what threatens democratic discourse. As this phase closed, the room felt quieter, but more strained. The clash had moved beyond sound bites into something closer to an ethical standoff. Cruz had reinforced the idea that leadership requires restraint shaped by historical awareness. Omar had reinforced the idea that restraint demanded selectively can become another form of control. The audience was left not with answers, but with a choice about which risk they feared more. The exchange entered its most strategic phase when both figures stopped reacting to each other and began speaking past the room, toward the invisible audience that actually mattered. At this point, the hearing was no longer about clarification or defense, but about narrative control and future positioning. Every sentence now carried an awareness of how it would be clipped, replayed, and interpreted by viewers who would never watch the full session. The substance still mattered, but the framing mattered more, because framing determines memory. This was where politics quietly replaced debate, without either side admitting the transition. Ted Cruz shifted into what longtime observers recognize as his most disciplined mode, the role of institutional guardian rather than ideological combatant. He stopped citing specific statements and instead spoke about precedent, about how certain patterns repeat whenever language drifts away from precision. His argument was not that intent is irrelevant, but that institutions cannot function if they adjudicate intent instead of impact. In his telling, history does not remember explanations, it remembers outcomes. That framing subtly recast him as someone defending a process rather than prosecuting a person. Ilhan Omar recognized that pivot immediately and countered by reframing the process itself as contested terrain. She argued that calls for neutrality often disguise inherited assumptions about whose pain is legible and whose is negotiable. From her perspective, insisting on a single standard of acceptable expression without interrogating power dynamics creates an illusion of fairness. She suggested that some communities are permitted rhetorical excess, while others are punished for imprecision. This was less a rebuttal than an attempt to widen the frame beyond the hearing room. A controversial question hovered over this section without ever being voiced directly. Is equal enforcement of norms always the same as equitable enforcement? And if not, who decides when deviation is contextual and when it is disqualifying? These questions resist clean answers, which is precisely why they are so politically useful. They allow each side to claim principle while accusing the other of bad faith. Cruz responded by narrowing the aperture again, a deliberate move that signaled his awareness of the trap. He acknowledged historical injustice in broad terms, but insisted that present authority still carries present obligations. In his formulation, moral complexity does not excuse linguistic shortcuts that activate old prejudices. The implication was clear even if unstated. Power requires discipline precisely because history is messy. By keeping his tone measured, he aimed to look reasonable rather than righteous. Omar's reply was more reflective than defiant, and this shift surprised some in the room. She spoke about the exhaustion of constantly translating one's speech to avoid misinterpretation, while others enjoy rhetorical latitude. Her critique was not that standards exist, but that they are applied unevenly and often retroactively. She framed her experience as living inside a permanent presumption of malice. This reframing invited the audience to consider the emotional cost of perpetual scrutiny. Humor surfaced again, but this time it carried an edge. A remark about how screenshots have longer memories than voters drew a brief, uneasy laugh. Cruz's dry acknowledgement that the internet does not believe in redemption arcs landed with similar effect. These moments were not jokes so much as acknowledgments of shared cynicism about modern politics. They functioned as pressure valves in a conversation otherwise tightening by the minute. The underlying struggle in this phase was over legitimacy. Cruz sought to establish legitimacy through alignment with institutional continuity and historical caution. Omar sought to establish legitimacy through lived experience and systemic critique. Neither approach is inherently illegitimate, but they compete for moral authority in very different ways. The hearing became a proxy battle over which form of legitimacy should dominate public discourse. For viewers, this created a strange duality. One could agree with Cruz's insistence on precision without endorsing his broader politics. One could empathize with Omar's critique of selective outrage without excusing every contested phrase. The discomfort came from realizing that these positions are not mutually exclusive. Politics, however, rarely rewards such nuance. As the minutes passed, the emotional temperature cooled, even as the stakes rose. This was no longer about a single exchange, but about signaling to allies and adversaries alike. Cruz was signaling that certain rhetorical lines would be enforced regardless of identity. Omar was signaling that enforcement itself must be interrogated, or it becomes another form of exclusion. Both were speaking to their bases, but also to history. The most telling aspect of this phase was what did not happen. There was no apology demanded or offered, no dramatic walkout, no definitive rhetorical knockout. Instead, the exchange hardened positions while clarifying them. Each side emerged more clearly defined, for better or worse. Clarity, in this sense, was both the product and the cost of the confrontation. As this segment drew to a close, It became evident that resolution was never the goal. The goal was definition of values, of boundaries, of who gets to speak with authority and under what conditions. Cruz had defined accountability as non-negotiable, even when uncomfortable. Omar had defined critique as necessary, even when disruptive. The audience was left to decide which definition felt more convincing, or whether the real failure lay in the system that demands such binary choices. The final phase did not arrive with a bang, but with a kind of controlled exhaustion that often marks the end of high-stakes political confrontation. The room felt quieter, not because anything had been settled, but because everyone understood that the remaining time would not change minds. What remained was interpretation, the slow process by which viewers would decide what they had just witnessed and why it mattered. This was the moment when rhetoric gives way to residue, when arguments stop moving forward and begin to sink in. And in politics, residue often matters more than resolution. Ted Cruz closed his line of questioning with a tone that signaled institutional finality rather than personal triumph. He did not demand contrition or attempt to force a final concession. Instead, he reiterated the principle that public officials inherit the weight of history whether they ask for it or not. Language, in this framing, is not a private possession once spoken from a position of power. It becomes part of a collective record that others must live with long after the hearing ends. Ilhan Omar responded not by retreating, but by shifting into reflection. She spoke about the paradox of representation in a polarized system, where visibility amplifies both voice and vulnerability. To represent those who feel unheard often requires confronting institutions that are uncomfortable with critique. But that confrontation carries risk, because discomfort is easily reframed as danger. Her closing posture suggested endurance rather than victory, survival rather than conquest. What made this ending unusually heavy was the absence of catharsis. There was no decisive moral reckoning, no sentence that cleanly resolved the tension. Instead, the hearing ended with two incompatible truths sitting side by side. One truth insists that language must be disciplined because history remembers harm longer than intention. The other insists that discipline unevenly enforced becomes another mechanism of exclusion. For viewers, this produced an unsettling realization. The conflict was not about misunderstanding that could be cleared up with better phrasing. It was about competing theories of responsibility in a fractured society. Is responsibility primarily about minimizing harm to vulnerable communities, even if that limits rhetorical freedom? Or is responsibility about maintaining universal standards, even when those standards fall unevenly? This unresolved tension explains why moments like this linger in public memory. They do not offer closure, but they force alignment. Audiences leave not with answers, but with reinforced intuitions about power, fairness, and trust. Some see the exchange as proof that accountability is finally being enforced without exception. Others see it as evidence that accountability itself has become selective theater. The media ecosystem amplifies this effect rather than moderating it. Short clips strip away nuance, turning layered arguments into symbolic gestures. A pause becomes a smirk. A clarification becomes a dodge. A principle becomes an accusation. What survives is not the complexity of the exchange, but its emotional shorthand. This is how political meaning is condensed and redistributed. Yet, beneath the spectacle lies a deeper institutional problem. Democratic systems rely on shared assumptions about good faith, but polarization erodes those assumptions. When participants no longer believe that standards are applied evenly, every enforcement feels suspect. When audiences no longer believe that critique is sincere, every challenge feels weaponized. The result is a cycle where mistrust feeds performative confrontation, which in turn deepens mistrust. In that sense, the hearing functioned less as a judgment and more as a diagnostic. It revealed how difficult it has become to hold public figures accountable without triggering accusations of bias. It revealed how difficult it has become to critique institutions without being accused of undermining them. And it revealed how easily moral language can harden into factional identity. None of these problems can be solved by sharper questioning or better messaging alone. The most sobering takeaway from this final phase is that both participants were, in their own ways, rational actors. Neither behaved randomly or impulsively. Each followed incentives created by voters, media, and party structures. The clash was not a breakdown of the system, but an expression of how the system currently works. That realization is more unsettling than any single accusation. As the hearing concluded and the room emptied, what lingered was not outrage, but fatigue. Fatigue from a politics that demands constant moral vigilance without offering moral repair. Fatigue from debates that generate heat but rarely produce trust. Fatigue from a system that treats conflict as content rather than as a problem to be solved. This fatigue is quiet, but it is cumulative. In the end, the confrontation did not answer the question of who was right. It answered a different question, one that matters just as much. It showed how modern American politics processes disagreement when consensus is no longer expected, not through resolution, but through spectacle, alignment, and endurance. And that, perhaps, is the most honest verdict the hearing could deliver.